The dim glow of the restaurant lights cast a warm, secretive ambience over Chloe as she sat across from Joe, her so-called friend. A jazz melody wove through the space, soft but alluring, like the thrill she felt being here tonight. Chloe was a picture of perfection, not a hair out of place. Her makeup subtly accentuating the sharp lines of her cheekbones, her red lipstick bold against the muted lighting. She felt alive in a way she rarely did anymore, hidden from the life she had meticulously crafted with Alan, her husband. But tonight, she wasn't Alan's Chloe. She was Joe's Chloe, and she reveled in that feeling. Joe leaned back in his chair, exuding a confidence that drew her in. He was the type who lived life on his own terms, a quality that both frightened and fascinated her. Just sitting here, laughing and listening to him talk about his next big adventure, she felt herself slipping further from her life of predictability. But just as Chloe's laughter lingered in the air, a familiar ringtone snapped her out of the moment. Her heart skipped a beat as she glanced down at her phone screen. It was Alan. "Everything all right?" Joe asked, a hint of curiosity flickering in his eyes. "Oh, it's nothing," she said, forcing a lightness in her tone as she swiped to ignore the call. "Just my husband. He thinks I'm out with old friends." A sly smile tugged at the corners of Joe's mouth. "Seems like you've got things pretty well figured out." Chloe mirrored his grin, but a chill ran down her spine. Alan's timing was uncanny, and his call unsettled her. Just as she tried to shake off the feeling, her phone buzzed again. It was Alan again. She forced a smile at Joe, excusing herself as she answered in a hushed tone. "Hey, Alan. I'm out with a few friends from the conservatory. Just a little catch-up." There was silence on the other end. Then Alan's voice, low but firm. "Where are you right now, Chloe?" Chloe's blood ran cold. She tried to laugh it off, keeping her voice as steady as she could. "Oh, don't worry. I'm just at a quiet spot with some old friends." Alan's response was calm, almost too calm. "Then look around and wave, Chloe." The word struck her like a bolt of lightning, and she felt her pulse race as she slowly turned. There, at a dimly lit table near the corner, sat Alan, his eyes fixed on her with an expression that sent her heart plummeting. Across from him was a woman Chloe didn't recognize, professional-looking, with an air of quiet confidence that made Chloe's skin prickle. With her mind racing, Chloe forced herself to rise and walk over, masking her anxiety with a polite smile. "Alan," she said, feigning surprise as she glanced at the woman. "Didn't expect to see you here. Who's your friend?" Alan's face remained unreadable as he introduced the woman. "This is Jessica. She's my lawyer." Chloe's heart skipped a beat, but she kept her composure. Jessica, however, returned Chloe's gaze with a cool, unwavering stare, as if she could see right through her. "Lawyer?" Chloe asked, letting out a small laugh as she took a seat at their table, doing her best to appear calm. "What? Are you in some kind of legal trouble I should know about?" Alan's smile was cold as he replied, "Oh, you could say I've found myself in an unfortunate situation." As Chloe opened her mouth to respond, Alan leaned forward, his voice low, but laced with a hint of dark amusement. "You know, Chloe, life has a funny way of catching up with us, doesn't it?" Chloe's confident facade cracked for a fraction of a second as she met his gaze, the weight of his words pressing down on her. She could feel Jessica's eyes on her, scrutinizing every move, every flicker of emotion. But she forced herself to smile, straightening her shoulders. "So, Alan," she said, trying to regain control of the situation, "is this some sort of test? Checking to see if your wife can make it through a quiet dinner without her husband lurking around?" Alan's gaze was unyielding. "I'd say it's more of a reality check." Before she could respond, he pulled out his phone and tapped the screen, holding it up so Chloe could see. It was a recording, one that began with Joe's voice. Her stomach twisted as she listened to Joe's unmistakable laugh, casual and familiar, chatting with someone she couldn't yet hear. "Hey, so, that woman you're with tonight, is she, serious about you?" Chloe's heart raced as she heard Joe respond with a smug laugh. "Let's just say she's serious about keeping things exciting." Never a dull moment with Chloe. Alan locked eyes with her as the recording continued, each word a dagger, each laugh a knife twisting deeper. Chloe's face drained of color as she realized the full scope of what Alan had done. In a low voice, Alan leaned in and whispered, "Still think you've got everything figured out, Chloe?" As Chloe sat frozen in her chair, trying to process the gravity of Alan's words, she felt herself struggling to breathe. The confident, playful facade she'd worn all night was crumbling, piece by piece, with each damning word from Joe's recording. She looked back at Alan, her mind scrambling for a way out, for something to say that might convince him this was all some kind of misunderstanding. But Alan wasn't done. "Let me make it clear," he said, his voice dangerously calm. "This isn't just about a friendly chat with Joe or your little catch-up over drinks tonight. It's about every lie, every story you spun, every detail you thought you could keep hidden." Jessica, who had remained silent until now, finally spoke up, her tone professional and cold. "You see, Chloe, Alan hired me to help navigate some unfortunate realities. And from what I've gathered, it's in his best interest to be prepared." "Prepared?" Chloe's voice trembled slightly, though she forced herself to stay composed. "Prepared for what?" Alan's lips curled into a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "For the inevitable fallout, Chloe. For when everything you've kept hidden comes to light." Chloe's mind was racing, a mix of indignation and desperation. She'd underestimated Alan, thought him too predictable, too focused on his work to ever consider prying into her life. She thought she could keep her secrets buried beneath a veneer of charm and clever explanations. Yet here he was, sitting across from her with ironclad resolve, peeling back the layers of her carefully crafted life. She forced a laugh, though her voice was edged with anger. "So you're telling me you've been spying on me? What? Are you so insecure that you have to go through my life with a microscope?" Alan raised an eyebrow, his smile never wavering. "Funny. I'd say it's less about insecurity and more about honesty. Something you've forgotten, apparently." Chloe's fists clenched under the table. But before she could respond, she saw Joe emerge from the restroom, scanning the restaurant until his eyes met hers. He gave her a small wave, grinning as he approached, oblivious to the tense scene awaiting him. "Hey, Chloe," Joe said casually, but as he stepped closer and noticed Alan, his expression faltered. "Ah, I didn't know you'd have company." Alan's smile widened as he gestured to the empty seat beside Chloe. "Please, Joe, join us. It's always nice to put a face to a name, especially when that face has been such a frequent topic of conversation." Joe glanced at Chloe, confused, before reluctantly sitting down. He gave Alan a guarded look, clearly unsure of his role in the unfolding drama. Chloe, meanwhile, shot him a silent, pleading glance, urging him to play it cool, but Joe's discomfort was already visible. "So, Joe," Alan continued, his tone almost conversational, "how long have you and Chloe been catching up?" Joe hesitated, glancing at Chloe for guidance, but her expression gave him nothing to work with. Well, not that long, really. Just some old friends reconnecting, you know?" Alan chuckled, shaking his head. "I'm sure you'd like to think that. But it seems like you two have shared more than just a casual drink. In fact, I've got a whole recording of tonight's catch-up right here." He tapped his phone, ready to play it again. Joe's face turned pale, and Chloe felt a mixture of fury and dread twisting in her stomach. She couldn't let this continue. "Enough, Alan," she said, her voice firm but brittle. "What do you want? Are you trying to humiliate me? Because if that's your goal, congratulations. You've succeeded." Alan's smile faded, and he looked at her with a steady, penetrating gaze. "Humiliation? Chloe, this isn't about embarrassing you. This is about giving you a taste of the truth, something you've been avoiding. And frankly, this is about setting myself free from the lies you've buried me under." Jessica placed a manila envelope on the table, sliding it toward Chloe. "Inside is a summary of all the evidence we've gathered, Chloe," she said, her tone devoid of sympathy. "Text messages, emails, photos. It's comprehensive." Joe looked down at the envelope, his expression one of dawning horror. He leaned toward Chloe, whispering, "You told me you didn't know, that you had this under control." "Quiet, Joe," Chloe snapped, her voice barely concealing her panic. Alan leaned back, his expression satisfied. "This is what you do, isn't it, Chloe? You build these webs of deception, thinking you can always stay one step ahead. But tonight, there's no running, no more excuses. Chloe felt her hands trembling, but she refused to let him see her falter. And what exactly do you expect me to do, Alan? Grovel? Apologize? Her voice sharpened, her anger flaring. You're no saint either. You're so wrapped up in your career, your precious routines, that you barely even notice I'm there. Alan's face hardened, but he kept his voice calm. And that justifies all of this? Sneaking around, lying? That's the story you're telling yourself? Because I don't believe for a second that's why you're here with Joe. Joe, uncomfortable and clearly regretting his involvement, shifted in his seat. Look, maybe I should. This is between you two. Oh, I think you're a key part of this, Joe, Alan said sharply. After all, it's you she chose to share her secrets with. Chloe's voice cracked with frustration as she turned on Joe. Why did you even come over here? You should have left when you had the chance. But Joe was done taking orders. Me? You're the one who led me on, who said we'd figure this out, that you had things handled with your husband. Now look at this mess. Alan watched them, a look of grim satisfaction in his eyes as the blame and resentment swirled between them. But Jessica, ever the professional, cut through the chaos with a clear, decisive tone. Chloe, as your husband's lawyer, I'm here to facilitate an amicable separation. If you want to avoid further exposure, I'd advise you to cooperate. Chloe's fury turned cold. She could see the setup now. Alan wasn't here for an argument or even for revenge. He was here to make his exit, and he had every piece of evidence lined up to ensure he came out unscathed. This wasn't a moment of weakness for him. It was his plan all along. Without another word, she snatched the envelope off the table and rose to leave, her jaw clenched. She cast one last, venomous glance at Alan, who watched her with an air of finality that left no room for reconciliation. As she walked out of the restaurant, Joe stayed behind, his shoulders hunched, realizing too late that he had been a mere pawn in a much larger game. As Chloe stormed out of the restaurant, her mind was a whirlwind of anger, humiliation, and fear. She felt trapped, her carefully constructed life crumbling around her, the foundation shattered by Alan's calculated move. Every step she took was fueled by her desire to regain control, to turn the tables back in her favor somehow. She would not go down quietly. She clutched the envelope, her hands shaking as she replayed the encounter in her mind. Alan's cold, calculated demeanor, Jessica's dispassionate professionalism, Joe's spineless backpedaling. It was all too much. She had spent months planning her next moves, balancing two worlds, and now, with one bold move, Alan had toppled it all. But Chloe wasn't done yet. Chloe arrived home, and after a quick, steadying breath, she spread out the contents of the envelope on her kitchen table. Photos, text transcripts, timestamps. Alan had been watching her for far longer than she'd realized. It was all here, meticulously documented. She swallowed hard, a bitter feeling clawing its way into her throat. He'd collected everything, laid it all out to ruin her. But she wasn't about to give him the satisfaction. The phone rang, startling her. She half expected it to be Alan, calling to continue his verbal assault, but instead, Joe's name appeared on the screen. She hesitated but finally answered. What? She snapped. Chloe. Joe began, his voice uncertain. Look, I didn't know he was going to pull something like that. I thought you had everything handled. I thought so too, Joe, she said coldly, until you sat there like a deer in headlights, giving him exactly what he wanted. You didn't even try to back me up. Joe sighed, his voice defensive. How was I supposed to know? He had all that evidence. He trapped both of us. Maybe you should have been more honest with me from the start. Honest with you? She retorted, her voice laced with venom. You think I owe you honesty after everything you've done? You were fine playing along when it suited you, but the second things get tough, you turn on me? Pathetic. There was a pause before Joe responded, his tone turning cold. You know what, Chloe? Maybe Alan's right to walk away. I should have seen through you a long time ago. He hung up, leaving Chloe standing there, gripping the phone tightly as his words echoed in her ears. She was alone now. Joe had cut ties, and Alan had already begun the process of dismantling her life. But if they thought she would just sit back and let them, they were sorely mistaken. The next morning, Chloe wasted no time. She called the best divorce attorney she could find, a fierce woman named Elaine, who came highly recommended for her ability to turn cases on their heads. Alan wants to make this ugly? Chloe muttered to herself. Fine. Let's see how he handles it when I fight back. Elaine met with Chloe the same afternoon, her sharp gaze assessing the situation as Chloe laid out the story, skimming over her affair with Joe and focusing instead on Alan's paranoia and obsessive behavior. Elaine nodded, listening with a calculating look. We'll build a case around emotional distress and invasion of privacy. If he's been collecting evidence this extensively, we might be able to argue that he crossed legal boundaries. Chloe allowed herself a small smile. For the first time in days, she felt a glimmer of hope. Meanwhile, Alan had retreated to his brother's house, taking a few days to unwind and prepare for what lay ahead. Despite the painful confrontation with Chloe, he felt a sense of relief. He had taken control of his life, severed himself from the web of lies she had spun around him. Yet, as he sat across from his brother, Lucas, sharing the details of the encounter, he couldn't ignore a nagging feeling. Think she'll fight back? Lucas asked, raising an eyebrow. She seems the type to go down swinging. Alan sighed, shaking his head. I'm sure she will. She doesn't like losing, and she'll do whatever she can to turn this on me. But honestly, Lucas, I don't care anymore. I just want to be free. Lucas studied him for a moment, then gave him a supportive nod. Good. Because if you're ready to be done with her, it's time to cut her off completely. No communication outside of the lawyers. No checking up on her. Nothing. Just move forward. Alan nodded, taking his brother's words to heart. Chloe had been a significant part of his life, but now it was time to sever the ties completely. He wasn't going to give her the satisfaction of dragging him back into her chaos. A few days later, Chloe received the divorce papers. She looked at them in disbelief, her mind racing. Alan had clearly covered every base, stipulating terms that favored him financially, terms that would leave her with little if she didn't fight back. He'd even frozen some of their joint accounts, making it clear he had no intention of letting her access his assets without a legal battle. But Chloe wasn't about to let him dictate the terms. She set up a meeting with Elaine, who had crafted a countersuit that pushed back against Alan's claims, arguing for half of their shared assets, as well as compensation for the emotional harm Alan's surveillance had caused her. Play dirty if you have to, Chloe, Elaine advised. Men like Alan think they can walk all over you once they've gathered enough evidence. But remember, you have a right to fight back. Chloe's resolve hardened. She wasn't going to be the victim of Alan's self-righteous crusade. She would come out of this battle victorious, even if it meant playing a few dirty tricks of her own. The legal proceedings began, with each side digging deeper, gathering every scrap of evidence to discredit the other. Alan's lawyer, Jessica, presented a straightforward case, using the recordings and photos to establish Chloe's infidelity and arguing that Alan deserved a clean break without the need for financial compensation. But Chloe and Elaine fought back, using emotional appeals and testimonies to paint Alan as a cold, unfeeling husband who had pushed her to seek comfort elsewhere. Both sides escalated, and soon, the case became a bitter spectacle, with family members, friends, and even neighbors pulled in as witnesses. Alan's brother, Lucas, testified on his behalf, while Chloe called on her friends to back her claim of Alan's controlling tendencies. Each hearing was tense, each exchange filled with barely concealed resentment. But after weeks of back and forth, the judge finally handed down a decision, awarding Alan a majority of the assets, but allowing Chloe a modest settlement. It wasn't the outcome she'd hoped for, but it was something. When the final hearing ended, Alan walked out of the courthouse, feeling the weight of the past few months lift from his shoulders. Chloe stood a few feet away, her face etched with anger and disbelief as she realized just how much she had lost. She took a step toward him, her voice a low, bitter whisper. You think you've won, Alan? This isn't over. Alan met her gaze, his expression calm, his voice steady. No, Chloe. It is over. Whatever game you thought you could play, it's done. I'm walking away, and there's nothing you can do to change that. Without another word, he turned and walked away, leaving Chloe standing in the cold, the realization settling in that her empire of lies had crumbled. She had gambled everything, but in the end, she had lost it all. As Chloe stood outside the courthouse, watching Alan walk away without a backward glance, a hollow emptiness filled her. This wasn't how she had envisioned her life unraveling. She had been so certain she could keep everything in her control, managing her marriage with Alan while indulging in the thrill of her relationship with Joe. But now, stripped of the facade she had so carefully crafted, she was left to confront the wreckage of her own making. A cold breeze swept through, sending a chill down her spine. Alone, with no one to blame but herself, Chloe finally felt the weight of her choices. She had lost Alan's love, the life they had built together, and the respect of those around her. Joe, too, had vanished without a trace, leaving her with nothing but memories of the fleeting excitement he had once provided. It all felt empty now, like a shadow of something that had never truly existed. In the days that followed, Chloe found herself in a haze, going through the motions, but feeling as if she were living someone else's life. The apartment she had hastily rented felt cold and foreign, the emptiness echoing the loneliness that had taken root within her. The silence was oppressive, and without Alan's familiar presence or even Joe's sporadic texts, Chloe was left with nothing but her own regrets. One evening, as she sat alone, scrolling through old photos of her and Alan, a pang of longing hit her. She saw the laughter in his eyes, the quiet moments they had shared, the dreams they had once built together. But those moments felt like a lifetime ago, a life she had single-handedly shattered. Chloe's friends had distanced themselves, some out of disappointment, others out of quiet judgment. She felt the sting of isolation more acutely each day, the reality of her decisions settling like a permanent ache. Eventually, she reached out to a therapist, hoping to make sense of her choices and the person she had become. It wasn't easy facing her mistakes, but bit by bit, she began to unravel the reasons behind her need for thrill, her restlessness, her endless search for excitement. She realized she had been chasing something that didn't exist, mistaking recklessness for freedom, infidelity for passion. Meanwhile, Alan found himself slowly rebuilding his life. The pain of betrayal still lingered, but he was surrounded by the support of his family and friends who had rallied around him through the ordeal. Lucas, his brother, had been his steady anchor, always ready with words of encouragement and the reminder that life could and would move forward. In time, Alan began to rediscover pieces of himself he had lost in the turmoil of his marriage. He took up hobbies he'd set aside, reconnected with old friends, and allowed himself to imagine a future unburdened by distrust and lies. Though he wasn't quite ready to open his heart to someone new, he felt a quiet hope, a sense of renewal that grew stronger each day. Months passed, and Chloe found herself on the path of self-reflection and healing. She had come to accept her mistakes and was working to rebuild her life, this time with a focus on honesty and accountability. She no longer sought out fleeting thrills, realizing the hollowness of those temporary escapes. Instead, she invested time in herself, facing the flaws she had once tried to hide, and slowly but steadily learning to be content in her own company. One afternoon, she saw Alan from a distance at a small cafe. He was sitting with Lucas, laughing over a cup of coffee, his face relaxed and peaceful in a way she hadn't seen in years. For a moment, she considered approaching him, but then decided against it. She realized that Alan had found his peace, and perhaps so could she. A faint smile touched her lips as she watched him, grateful for the good memories they had once shared, even if they were now just memories. She had lost a great deal, but in the end, she had found something unexpected herself. As Chloe turned and walked away from the cafe, she felt a glimmer of hope for the first time in a long time. Her past was behind her, a part of her story she could never change. But her future, she realized, was something she could shape with each choice she made, one step at a time.